Thanks be to God. Right? Quit studying, start living. Right? We have a church full of saints. Good sinning saints, but we're all saints. Who have been in this faith for a very long time. It's time that we stop studying and start living. Right? And don't completely stop studying. Right? He's not meaning that. He's not meaning just like give up on reading and learning about God. We're going to hit that in 3 weeks, don't worry. But the point being that as we mature in faith, there's a piece of what God is calling us to do, which is about simply living out the faith that we've been handed, that we've learned, and that many of you have been through big things in life. You've been through loss of job and loss of children and loss of spouses and divorces and everything you can possibly imagine. Bankruptcies and businesses booming and selling companies and retirement and all of these things, marriages, you've been through them all. And there's a world who needs to know how to walk in faith following your example. Right? Paul's famous for saying, "Follow me as I follow Christ." How good would it be if each of us here and online today could say, "Follow me as I follow Christ, as I live out the faith that God has given me." So there are these two young fish swimming alongside each other, and they happen to meet an older fish coming from the other way. And the older fish nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" So the two fish swim for a little bit, and one fish turns to the other and says, "What the heck's water?" The water is the habits, the unthinking choices and invisible decisions that surround us, that just by looking at them, they become visible again. How many of you know your habits? I know some of mine, right? I was thinking about this last week. Like, what are the things I do every day that I don't even think about I do? Like breath, right? They're the things that like just happen, right? I get up and do the same thing virtually every day. I take a shower the same way. I do the same order of things in the shower. And part of this is happening because it's become habituated in my life. So habits never really disappear. We know from brain science that they're encoded into the structures of our brain. The problem is your brain can't tell the difference between a good habit and a bad habit. So if you have a bad one, it's just lurking there, waiting for the right cues to trigger the habit to happen and to sense the right reward, so it just keeps happening over and over and over. So if you've never read the book by Charles Duhigg, I challenge you to read it this year. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It's called The Power of Habits. And in this book, Duhigg talks about what he calls habit loops. You didn't know you were going to get a lesson on habits when you came to church today. So all habits follow the same simple 3-step loop. The first is the cue. This is a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode of which habit to use. It's like a light switch. And cues can be almost anything, right? You ever wonder why you have a whole plan to not behave a certain way when you enter your family's house, and as soon as you come in, you behave exactly how you didn't intend? That's a habit. A light switch has been flipped. For me, I remember growing up, going back to my parents' church after I was in college, and there was a trigger for me. Like, I don't even know if I should say this trigger because you might start calling me it. I had a friend who had a set of deacons because I grew up in a Baptist church, and these deacons just called me Red. It's my only name growing up. "What's up, Red? How you doing, Red?" And that word was like a trigger for me, right? It just turned me back into a middle schooler. Didn't matter how old I was. All the feelings of middle school, all of that just came flooding back into my consciousness. And then I would respond to them in the same way that I had historically, even though that's not how I wanted to be in that moment anymore. Right? This is a trigger. This is a cue. It can happen from a specific time of day. Certain times of day can be your trigger. It can be an emotion. It can be a sequence of thoughts. It can be the company of particular people, right? Anything can be a cue. Now, the second part of the loop is what's called routines. Now, these routines can be physical, they can be emotional, they can be mental, and routines can be very complex or they can be super simple, right? So the cue triggers the habit, and then the action rolls out of that habit, whether it's a feeling, whether it's something you do. And then all of this leads to the third part of the loop, which is called the reward. This helps your brain figure out that this particular loop is worth remembering. And rewards can range from food or drugs that cause physical sensations. Like, you had that one dessert that your grandma always made, right? And as soon as you taste it, everything comes back. Or you get this feeling when you're with certain people and you love it, even though those people may not be great for you. And so you just keep going back to that, right? These are the reward centers in us. And it creates an emotional payoff of some kind, such things as pride or praise or self-congratulation. In fact, the entire world of social media is built off of this loop. You ever wondered why you look at how many thumbs up or hearts or care hugs you get on Facebook? It's a brain loop. Like, they've learned how to code into you, well, if you get praise from somebody, you'll post again. Right? So it's important for us to understand, the world understands it, coders understand it. So us beginning to understand that these loops happen matter. Now, some habits matter more than others in remaking our lives. These habits are called keystone habits. And they can influence how people work and eat and play and live and communicate. Keystone habits are those that teach us that success doesn't depend on getting every single thing right, but relies on identifiers, these few key priorities, and those fashion us into having powerful levers, these levers of change. Now you may be saying, what's an example of a keystone habit? Exercise. Clearly, I don't know much about it. But exercise is a keystone habit. And what happens is that when people build this habit in their life, maybe they go to the gym because that's where their community is. And they have this feeling of people and relationship that happens at the gym. And so that triggers this cue, they work out. But that habit doesn't just affect working out. What scientists have realized is that the keystone habits actually end up changing other things too. Because when you start working out, you start thinking about eating better. And you start thinking about getting better sleep. And because the endorphins have happened in your body, you actually sleep better than you have in normal times. So it triggers a better sleep pattern. And you see how these things begin to roll out in these keystone habits. Keystone habits change the things around us. So Aristotle once said that we are what we repeatedly do. Now, most of my PhD work is in ethics and in theological ethics. And there's this big fight within theological ethics of which comes first, the virtue or the practice? Which comes first, just dreaming to have a virtue or putting that virtue into practice until it becomes a reality? I say, let's do both. There is a link between our inner spirituality and our outward action. We can't miss this. There is a clear link between our inner spirituality and our outward action. So the series that we're jumping into for the next 6 weeks, I'm very excited about. It's all about thinking, what are the keystone habits necessary for living a missional way of life? So not just being a church who comes here to worship on a Sunday morning and gets our buzz from coming to church on Sunday morning, because that's a habit too, that creates a trigger for us and it creates a positive response, and so we keep coming. So not just that, and that's good, don't stop that, please. But what are the other keystone habits that once we leave this place, start creating radical change within us and with our neighborhoods and within our communities? So we're going to spend 6 weeks, starting today, looking at how do we create, reorient, and recreate habits or rhythms in our life that have a missional impact in our world. So if you'll go to the next slide, these are them. Bless, eat, listen, learn, and send or sent. Okay? We're going to spend a week on each one of these. And this is coming from some great work by a missiologist named Michael Frost. And so if you want to learn more about this outside of us, I'm happy to connect you with some of his works that are just fantastic in regards to this. So what do I mean by missional? What do I mean by missional habits or rhythms or practices? Missional is clearly engaging and alerting ourselves to what brings about or encourages the reign of God in ourselves and in our neighborhoods. Get that? So missional is what brings about and fosters the reign of God within us and within our neighbors and in our neighborhood. Now, for many of you, this is going to trigger the big E word, evangelism. Everybody freaked out by that yet? Now, part of why the big E word causes heart palpitations for many of us and has us running for the hills is because we were handed an idea of evangelism that brought fear to us, right? I grew up in a world where it wasn't odd on a given Sunday for the pastor to encourage everybody to get up and to go tell 3 friends about the love of Jesus. And if you're not an evangelist, you're like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm an introvert. I'm not an introvert. But other people are introverts. And they're like, this is the last thing I want to do. I don't even talk to my family, much less to a stranger, about what God and Jesus mean to me. And this word evangelicalism or evangelical has brought with it and has been co-opted by a specific political position, and I get that, but it has nothing to do with its actual roots, and so that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about what it means for us to live our faith in real time in the world that's in front of us. I'm happy. I chose to be a part of the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Why? Because being in a relationship with Jesus has changed my life. Being in a relationship with Jesus has made me more whole. It's given me connection in the midst of the darkest moments of my life. And in many ways, being connected to Jesus has made me more human and a better human. So if people ask me where my hope comes from, I want to share with them, and I want them to experience the same liberation that I've experienced in their own way within their own journey. Now, I don't know that I would consider myself an evangelist. I had this friend named Perry Paul Nazik. First time I met him, I was at a Christian conference working one of those booths, and his booth was right next to mine. And I was in student ministry at that time, so if I remember correctly, I think I was wearing a rainbow clown wig and like throwing things at senior adults as they walked past me to get them to come to my booth. Probably not the best experience. Perry, on the other hand, was 20 years older than me, and Perry's way was just to literally walk up to people and say, how's Jesus changed your life this week? Like, he was just an evangelist. It like ran through his blood. It was a part of who he is. You might know a person named Dennis Ashlock who's a lot like this. And I understand that most of us don't feel like Dennis or Perry. And here's what I want you to hear today. I don't think God's calling you to be Dennis and Perry. I think God is calling you to be you. And in the scriptures, part of what we hear is that certain people have been given the gift of evangelism. And Paul says, we should pray for them. Pray for them as they do this work of evangelism. And for the rest of us, we should live lives worthy of being questioned. Right? That's our work. Live lives worthy of being questioned. So that people begin to say, like, how are you doing that? Why do you do that thing that you do? Why do you keep inviting people over to your house? Why are you so nice to everyone? This is not something that's said about me. But my wife, on the other hand, it's said about her all the time. So consider this text from Colossians. Paul asked the people in Colossae, to pray that I will proclaim this message as clearly as I should. In other words, pray for Paul the evangelist in his proclamation, and they are to live wisely among those who are not believers and to make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you might have the right response for everyone. In other words, for the evangelist Paul, in his proclamation of the gospel, we should pray for us to live in word and deed in such a way as to provoke others to question our beliefs and their beliefs and to enter into this relational dialogue. So we should pray and live questionable lives. Now, any of us can do that. That doesn't require sweaty palms or heart palpitations or running from the word, the big E evangelism. In other words, it's just our job to surprise the world by what we do. Now, I think this is part of the problem. I think the church has stopped surprising the world. I think we're boring. I think the world generally considers us lame and generally considers that we're hypocritical and that we don't do the things that we say we're going to do. Now, whether we are that or not, we've all heard it said that perception is the rule, right? Perception becomes the truth. So how do we, as God's people, living in this community of St. Matthew in Walnut Creek in the East Bay, challenge those preconceived notions? What are some things that we can do in our world and in our community that bring about a new way? So, I'm the grandson of a missionary. My grandfather was Jack, who Jackson's named after. We called him Jacket because my sister couldn't say Jack when she was born, and she knew how to put on a jacket, so he became Jacket. And Jacket was known to as Jacket to everybody in the world by the time that he died. Jack was my greatest mentor. It's why we named my son after him. And I spent summer after summer on reservations across Oklahoma and New Mexico as he was a missionary to native peoples here in our country. Now, I learned a lot of things from my grandfather that I never learned in church. There's this whole idea, this whole study that we call missiology, right? It's the work of understanding the reign of God in our world and how to share that reign of God contextually within its place. And the role of a missiologist is to read their community. So it wouldn't work for my grandfather when he's working with the Navajo to do the same things that he did with the Cherokee and the Choctaw, because their experience of life was different. Their experience of the reservation was different. Their experience of so many things was different. So at each place, he had to learn. It was his job to come in and figure it out. Part of the problem, too, is, right, the church has handed over our responsibility to learn the culture, to learn about it, to be students of the culture, to understand what's happening in our world. Some of you, when I said social media, were like, ugh. It's not going away, peeps. The digital may freak you out. It's not going away. In fact, COVID's guaranteed it's implanted habitually in the lives of our community. Not just here, but in our neighborhood, in our schools, and everywhere. Part of our role is to be missiologists. David Bosch, a famous missiologist, my grandfather's favorite, wrote this: mission is more than and different from the recruitment to our brand of religion. It's alerting people to the universal reign of Jesus Christ. But to alert people to the universal reign of Jesus Christ, we have to speak their language. We have to speak in habits in a way that are interesting to them. See, this is the hard part. If you thought that Jesus calls us to be comfortable, he didn't. If what you've been hoping was that Pastor Rustin was going to bring comfort to you in our church, I'm not. Sorry. Hopefully you find comfort in being uncomfortable, because we're going to be there together. So part of living in our neighborhoods as missiologists means that we need to develop some rhythms and habits that help us live questionable lives, to help make our lives more questionable to the world around us. And by following Jesus in this way, we are fulfilling his mission. So each of these habits connect with a virtue we're trying to offer the world. So to bless, the habit of blessing others, is connecting us to what it means to be generous, to have the virtue of generosity. To eat connects us with the virtue of hospitality. Our world's craving hospitality. To listen connects us with the virtue of being Spirit-led. To learn connects us with the virtue of being Christ-like. And to be sent connects us with the virtue of being missional. My point is this: if you want to be generous, if you want to be hospitable, Spirit-led, Christ-like, missional, we can't just learn the values. We have to foster practices and habits. Now, much has been written about our time, right? This is a turbulent time. Culture is changing rapidly. The current statistic is that culture is changing twice the speed as it was pre-COVID. Because all of us are in our kind of bubbles. And we've seen it. We've seen it politically. We've seen it nationally. We've seen it in the world, that divisions are getting bigger. Unifiers are getting bigger. Everything's getting more complex quicker. Now, church leaders, Mike and I and the staff here have invested a lot of time trying to figure out how can we help our church embrace the necessary changes in order to engage the world around us. And changing our behavior is the most important challenge that we have. John Carter is a Harvard Business School professor, and he says this. He says, the central issue is never strategy. It's never structure. It's never culture or systems. The core of the matter is always about changing the behavior of people. If we change our behavior, the rest will come. So I'll be honest. I would love to grow our church. But not because I care one bit about being a bigger church or pastoring in a mega church setting. I've already done that and I left it to come here. I want our church to grow because if our church grows, that means our neighborhood and our world have had a larger opportunity to experience the love and the goodness and the healing and the hope and the redemption and the restoration of what a gathered community of Christ has to offer. Because if our church grows in our neighborhood, it should mean that we have less hungry, less poverty, less children suffering, having to eat meals that are free offered by our schools, less poverty, less loneliness, less homelessness, that all of these things should come with us living missionally in our world. And I value that difference. Our growth means more people are experiencing the transforming love of Jesus that in my darkest moments of depression were the things that kept me alive. And the community who believed that with me were the ones who stood beside me and behind me and in front of me in those dark moments. The core idea of mission in 1 Peter is that the faithful evangelical witness comes in the form of simple, daily obedience of Christian people living together in authentic community and going into the world as ambassadors for Christ. So will you go on this journey with me in building and developing some new habits that might make our lives a little bit more questionable to our neighbors around us? Are you in? Let's pray. God, we want more than anything for our world to be more whole, for each of us to be more complete. We long that poverty would end, that brokenness would be healed and restored, that people would live full and abundant lives, including us. So we ask that you help us. We know this is more than a 6-week journey. This is a lifetime journey. But awaken our eyes to where the Spirit is moving among us in our neighborhood and how to live into joining your Spirit where it's at work. Awaken us to our current keystone habits that are affecting our lives both in positive and negative ways. And then inspire us to create some new habits that make us have questionable lives so that more people will know of your love. In your name we pray.